Well, if you keep your Bibles open to Colossians, it's found on, if you're using a pew Bible, it's found on page 1832, if you want to follow along in the pew Bible. A few weeks ago, when we were last in Colossians, as followers of Jesus, we were preparing ourselves for the holidays. We're coming into Christmas and even Thanksgiving time. We wanted to prepare ourselves to be with family. And so we looked at what it meant to live in a family. And the family that we're going to be looking at today in this passage, you can see it's family they're talking about. It's the family of God. It's what the church looks like. In fact, if you have your Bibles open, look at chapter 3, verse 11. Let's go back to look at one of the things it says there. Paul and Timothy write, verse 11, "Here there is no Gentile or Jew." Where's the here? In the church. When God's people, the family of God, gather together, it says, there's no Gentile or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave or free, but Christ is all, and notice this, is in all. Christ is in each of us. When we have started following Jesus, Jesus Christ lives in us. And that means that you're my brother or sister. We're siblings in Jesus when we get together. So how do we get together as siblings? How do we promote peace and growth in Jesus as siblings without the pecking order? And so we looked at that a couple of weeks ago about how in Colossians chapter 3, verses 12 through 14, we need to make sure we put on clothing items of compassion and humility and kindness and gentleness and patience, and how we need to, when we're together, we need to talk about Jesus' saturated words when we're together, looking at God's word. We need to pray in a way that teaches. We saw that in Colossians 3, 15 through 17. We also need to sing songs that teach. Like this morning, the songs we've been singing reinforces the teaching of what it means to follow Jesus. Now, I want you to remember, too, that churches met in houses. And so every household, every morning you woke up, if you could put yourself back in time, you woke up and you were probably either a wife, a husband, a child, a slave, or a master. You fell in one of those categories, typically. Now that you've started following Jesus, Jesus has completely changed every relationship and how you relate to one another. So Jesus leaves no relationship undisturbed. And as we look at this list, we're asked about how we're going to live out our faith with these new relationships. And by the way, the things that Paul is going to ask the people in Colossians, the Colossian Christians to do is counter. It cuts against the grain of that part of the Roman Empire where they lived. It completely cuts against the grain. Everyone has been pre-programmed, I guess you'd say, by their culture and their upbringing, so that even when you hear today, when you hear the words, the titles, the name wife, certain things come to mind. When you hear the word husband, different cultures, things come to mind. When you hear the word child or slave, especially as Americans, master, those are loaded with expectations and roles. I think it's important for us to realize that the Bible was written and preserved by God for us as His inerrant word. It was written for us, but it wasn't written to us. Think about that. One of the things we have to do when you study the Bible is figure out what it meant to those people to whom it was written. And so often we just take it, well, it's written to me. No, it's written to someone else. It's for you. It's for you to grow in your faith in Jesus. It's for you to live as siblings in peace as you follow Jesus and go to the Dominican Republic and spread His light. It's written for you, but it's written to a group of people, a very specific group of people, and we need to understand who it's written to before we get to application. So before we look at this text, I want to give you some background on how they saw their role. The role of a wife, the role of a husband, the role of a child, the role of a slave, the role of a master. I want you to understand how the mindset of the day that this was written, the people to whom it was written, what they thought of it. Life in the Roman Empire was a male-dominated world. Let's just get that straight right from the beginning. It was a male-dominated world. It was a world, the Roman Empire was built on power, it was built on privilege, it was built on honor, and it was built on authority, and it was built on status. The hierarchy, that's how life was. It was just accepted. That's just what you were programmed to think of. Any role in life about power or powerless. Did you have the power and influence or didn't you? That's how they viewed the world. Very different from the way I think many of us view our world. But that's how they viewed their world. In fact, I want to show you a shocking quotation from a famous speech, kind of like, remember this speech, "Ask not what your country can do for you," right? Well, that's stuck with us as Americans. This is a similar type of speech that was given in the Greek and Roman world that is like the JFK "ask not" statement. And it's going to shock you a little bit, so I want to prepare you for what you're about to see. It's on the screen. It says this. It's about households. This is how they viewed households and their roles. They said this: "We keep mistresses for our enjoyment, concubines to serve our person each day, but we have wives for the bearing of legitimate offspring and to be faithful guardians of the household." That's how Roman and Greek men viewed life. Wives were distant relationships. Wives were property. You owned a wife. So try to understand that's who this is written to. And concubines, you see there, they were female household slaves. And little girls were married off at the age of 12 to much older men. 12. That's who it's written to. And men were in charge, and they got whatever they wanted, and the more wealth they had, the more they could take of whatever they wanted. Now that's the Roman and that's the Roman and Greek household. What about in the Jewish households? How did they view it? They had a little bit different take on it. They added a little bit different emphasis to it. Here's what they would say. They would say this. It's from Josephus. And this was infused in the mind of every man who grew up Jewish, and every little boy and girl understood this. Josephus writes this: "Let her therefore be obedient to him," speaking of the wife, "for God hath given authority to the husband." I want you to take those two quotations. I want you to put them together. This is who it's written to. A little girl is raised to let a man treat her any way he wants to because God says so. A little boy is raised to think that their God-given right is to treat a girl that way. That is a toxic mix when you take that cultural dynamic of the Roman and Greek mindset and combined it with a religious reason, and now you have to put up with this and be treated this way because God says so. That's who this is written to. But now that you're a follower of Jesus, I'm going to talk to you as if you're the people this is written to. Now that you're a follower of Jesus, Jesus has to retrain your brain from those quotations you just saw. He has to he has to transform relationships between men and women, between parents and children, between slaves and masters. In Jesus, Paul says, if they're a follower of Jesus, they're no longer a slave, they're your brother or sister. A woman is now your sister. Treat her as a sister, equal standing before God, co-active, co-workers in the gospel. And let me remind you of this too. When this letter of Colossians was read in these house churches, it was performed, usually by the letter carrier. Guess who was present when it was read? Husbands, wives, children, slaves, masters. They're all present. They're hearing this. They're hearing this, and they're trying to undo the baggage of their past as they're following Jesus now. This is a whole new way of living. Everybody is getting a wake-up call in the passage you're about to read. So and I say all of that just to get you ready for what we're about to go into. So in your outline, you'll see I've entitled this message, How to Begin Your New Day in the Family Gathering. New day. Oh, by the way, one other thing I should mention. This letter of Colossians was accompanied with another little letter that Paul wrote at the same time. The letter of Philemon accompanied the letter of Colossians. And the letter of Ephesians was written about the same time. In fact, when you put Colossians and Ephesians almost side by side, there's a lot of parallels by how they're all structured. And the instructions to the household, husbands, wives, children, slaves, parents, husbands, wives, very similar. So it's interesting to read those two letters side by side to understand the meaning. One of the things you'll see, I want to put a quotation from Ephesians, which parallels Colossians. Look what it says on the screen from Ephesians. It says this, Paul says to the Ephesian churches, and do not get drunk with wine, for that is debauchery, but be filled with the Spirit, addressing one another. Who's the one another? Wives, husbands, children, slaves, addressing one another. With what? Psalms. Look what he says. Hymns, spiritual songs, singing, making melody to the Lord in your hearts, giving thanks always and for everything to God the Father in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. Verse 21 is the big shocker. Submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. He says that as if to put a big sign over the door before you go in here. Understand, just because you were raised to think a certain way, you've got to set that aside and take that off when you come in here. Because in the church, we submit to one another. Nobody in the church is on a power trip. Nobody in the church is the authority. Jesus is the head of the church. And we are brothers and sisters in Jesus. Do you understand how radical this is? As Paul goes into teaching these household codes. Paul always says, submit to one another out of reverence. Keep submitting to one another. Jesus says the same thing, doesn't he? Whoever wants to be the greatest, Jesus says, in the kingdom has to become the what? The authority of everybody. No, that's not what a follower of Jesus does. Jesus says, if you want to be great, you've got to be the servant of all. What do servants do? They submit. What did Jesus do when he came? He laid down his life. Was he an authority? Absolutely. He's the Son of God. But look at how he acted. A cross-shaped life follows Jesus. That's what it means to pick up your cross in your home and in your church. Paul did say there was one occasion where he says, if you go into a church and you see something going on that doesn't look right, he says, don't submit to that. There's one instance that the Apostle Paul says, don't submit in this one situation. And here's the situation. It's on the screen. It's from his letter to the Galatian church. He says this. Paul says, we did not yield in submission for one moment so that the truth of the gospel might be preserved for you. But when Peter came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. What's Paul talking about there? There's a situation where Paul says, I wasn't about to submit to what Peter, the apostle Peter, had done in the church in Galatia. The apostle Peter was having fellowships and potlucks with everybody, Jews and Gentiles, men and women, just like they're supposed to, treat each other like siblings. And then Peter found out, oh boy, there's a group coming from Jerusalem that are really super legalistic, and they're going to say, you can't have Jews and Gentiles eating together in the church. You got to separate. That has to be two separate potlucks. Peter goes, oh, I better shape up. They're going to check on me. So Peter separated the Christians, put a wall between them. And then Paul shows up and says, what are you doing, Peter? You can't separate them. If you separate Christians, you destroy the gospel. And I won't submit to that, Paul says. I won't let anybody submit to a situation where what Jesus did on the cross is destroyed. Because you're not allowing Jews and Gentiles, male and female, and slave and free to be together as one body. If you start separating people, that's where he draws a line over and over again. He draws a line there. So there's these two buckets we are going to look at. One has to do with power, and the other has to do with being powerless. And would you write this down as we look at Colossians 3? Would you write down, first of all, that there's a new marital power, like marriage I'm talking about. There's a new marital power we're going to see here in verses 18 and 19. Look with me at Colossians 3:18. Look what it says. It says, wives, submit to your husbands. Anybody choking? It kind of depends upon what your background is, doesn't it? Well, I already showed you what the background of the people are who this was written to. Submit to it. What's he saying? Submit to it. Do whatever he wants. Give him whatever he wants. Is that what he means? I don't believe that's what Paul's saying here. Why would Paul warn these young Christians in verse 18 to take off those old patterns about the way you saw other people? Take those off. Why would he say, oh yeah, by the way, put this one back on. Keep doing this. He wouldn't do that. So what does he mean by submit? Submit, yes, but in what way? Submit in a new way. He's going to talk about submitting. Submission is not a bad word. It's a good word. We should submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. But what does this submission look like? Look what it says at the end of verse 18. It says, as is fitting in the Lord. So if you're a wife that's following Jesus, your new life is under King Jesus, not King Husband. And the way you viewed your power or powerlessness in your marriage has changed. And so would you write this down? Here's what Paul's saying, is a love that submits to Jesus before all others. There's a new, in your marriages, for those of you who are married, in your marriages, it's a new kind of power. It's a power of love that submits to Jesus before all others. That's to the wives. Look at verse 19. Look what he says to the husbands. He says, husbands, verse 19, husbands, love your wives. So a husband who follows Jesus is to love his wife. Love his wife. He's supposed to think about how he can love his wife. He's not supposed to think about how he has authority over his wife, power over his wife, reminding the wife she better do her verse. It's always a dangerous thing when people show up in my office and they want me to remind their spouse to do their verse. By the way, we all got verses to do, okay? Everybody's got a verse to do. We all have relationships we're in. But whenever you think it's your job to get somebody else to do their verse, all of a sudden you've become God. And nobody should do that. What we should do is love one another, and we each have to do our verse. Husbands, look what he says, verse 19, love your wives. Love your wife. What does he say in Ephesians? Like Christ loved the church. How did Christ love the church? He sacrificed for the church. Jesus Christ submitted his life to the Father and laid it down for us sacrificially. What does love mean? Husbands, love your wife like Jesus loved the church. So would you write this down? A love that submits to others through sacrifice. A love that submits to others through sacrifice. So this is the way the husband expresses his love, is by laying down his life sacrificially. He doesn't make demands. He doesn't violate the integrity of his wife. In fact, it's interesting. There's no words here in verse 19. Husbands, exercise your authority over your wives by loving them. No, he doesn't say that. There's no word of power. There's no word of authority here. It doesn't even talk about shared power. Not even shared. It doesn't do that. Nowhere in the text. So marriage, it has a new kind of power. It's a power of sharing life, a power of sharing love with each other. It's a power where you serve one another, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And then look what he says in verse 19. He also says to the husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. Why would he say don't be harsh? I already told you who this was written to. It was written to people who were, let's just say, brainwashed or programmed to see their role as a man in a certain way. And you have mistresses, and you have concubines, and you have a wife to have kids so you can pass on your stuff to. Keep your name going. That's how they saw it. So why would Paul say don't be harsh? What's the whole don't be harsh thing? Well, here's what happens. It's human nature. Husbands who have been raised that way are going to become very embittered that they have to give up so much to follow Jesus. So Paul's saying, don't be harsh, don't get embittered, no more despising your wives. You need to say goodbye to your mistresses. You need to stop what you're doing with any female concubines. You need to stop looking at your wife as only being good for having kids. And husbands, if you love your wives the way Jesus does, you're going to honor them at your own expense. Think about this. Application. Here we go. Application. To love your wife means that you are going to give up much more than she ever will. Think of that. If you love your wife the way Jesus loved the church, Jesus gave up a lot more for you than you ever will give up for him. And so to truly follow Jesus means like it feels like it's going to kill you. This is killing me. Exactly. Pick up your cross and follow Jesus and love your wife so sacrificially. You're going to feel like you're doing all the giving in. Exactly. That's what he's talking about. Love your wives. Don't be harsh with them. Don't get bitter. So that's a new kind of marital power. But now he gets into the parent-child relationship. Look at verse 20. Verse 20 says, children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. This pleases the Lord. So children are hearing this read in the house church, and they're hearing this going, really? I'm also in the Lord. I'm in the Lord as much as my parents are in the Lord. I have a relationship with God as much as my parents have a relationship with God. Exactly. So in number 2 in your outline, would you write this down? A new parental power. There's a new parental power. And so if you're a teenager today, you're a minor, you're a child, maybe you're hearing in this room or you're hearing my voice online, I just want you to know that you have to live out your relationship with Jesus by listening to the wisdom of your parents. Listen to their wisdom. Show your submission to your parents by following their wisdom, and he says, in everything. Now, there's limits to that. Obviously, you don't follow advice of a parent if they're asking you to disobey Jesus. You don't do that. But in all areas of life, listen to their wisdom. So would you write this down in your outline? Would you write down, follow others with wisdom? Write this down if you would. Follow others with wisdom. Now, he's talking to children, but you have to understand this too. It's written to a household with children. Some of those children are children of slaves. Now, put yourself in a slave child's body for a moment. And you've just got done hearing Paul say to the church that they have children who are in the Lord. In other words, you are equal to the owner's children. Paul has just raised the value of children high and said, if you're a child, You are now in Jesus as much as your parent. If you're a slave child, you're just as equal as anybody who's not a slave child. And then look what it says in verse 21. Fathers, do not embitter your children or they will become discouraged. You see, there's just something about the men in those days where their natural reaction, as followers of Jesus, their natural reaction is to become harsh and embittered. Why? Because they've had to give up so much. They've had to stop thinking their old ways. So look what it says in verse 21. Fathers, do not embitter your children or they will become discouraged. I mean, the dad held all the authority cards in the Roman and Jewish households. And a father could make or break his child's future back then. And so what he's saying here is, dads, control your emotions. Control yourself. Don't crush him. Don't deflate him. Don't push him too hard this way because they're going to go that way. So would you write this down? Control yourselves with love. Control yourself with love. What's really remarkable as you read this inspired word of God is that Paul and Timothy don't even mention the authority of the Father, because a father who follows Jesus never pulls out the authority card. Let me say that again. A father who follows Jesus never pulls out the authority card. Never. Something's wrong when that happens. If you attended a church and the pastor continually reminded you that he was in authority over you, run as fast as you can. Don't stay there. Those in authority, if they really have authority, don't have to remind people that they are in that position of influence. So any Christian dad who spends his time reminding himself or other people that he's in authority has failed as a follower of Jesus. Any pastor who spends their time reminding the congregation that they're the authority of the congregation, that pastor has failed to follow Jesus. A Christian father exchanges his authority over his children for a nurturing relationship of love. Control yourselves with love. Now let's get to the really difficult verses. Verses 22 through chapter 4, verse 1. It's about slavery in the typical Roman household. And the entire economy of the Roman Empire depended on slavery. They think that during that day, 35% of the Roman population in the empire, 35% were slaves. And no matter how you cut it, slavery is slavery is slavery is slavery. It's an evil system of injustice. Slavery is owning another human being for the purpose of financial profit. That's how you make money. And the one difference between the slavery that our country engaged in, the evil practice of slavery in our own history, is that we did it based upon race. In the Roman Empire, it had nothing to do what color your skin was. In the Roman Empire, slavery was about power and money. And we know from historical records that one of the most common followers of Jesus in the early church were widows, orphans, and slaves who had no power. Churches were full of slaves who were following Jesus. Now, when the powerful followers of Jesus and the powerless followers of Jesus get together as a family, they have to relate to each other in a new way. And slavery is about money. No money, no power. You know, it's really hard to talk about this topic because it touches, and it's especially difficult, I think, for me as a white man to talk about this topic. Upton Sinclair has this famous quote. He says, "It's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it." Let me say that again. It's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it. We sometimes are blinded to the things that we feel really strongly about. Have you stopped and looked at them again? Is there some motive that keeps you in power over people? Maybe it's even a financial motive. You know how many people theologically won't change their positions? You know why they won't change their positions? Not about major issues, but about minor things that they've written about, because they've written so much about it. Their character, their reputation theologically as an author or commentator, or even as a well-written pastor. They can't change their position. They've got too much money and books invested in this. They've got to keep on the same road. So if God does show them something else in the world, they can't change it, because it's amazing how difficult it is to get someone to change their understanding when their salary and their reputation depends on them not understanding it. And so when we look at this issue of slavery, I don't want to reduce it to, there's people who are employers and employees. That's belittling the text. Let's not take it to that point. But let's talk about it in these terms. Let's frame it like this. Number 3, a new financial power. In the church, we need to relate with one another when it comes to money in our view of power. And it's interesting, this is where Paul spills the most ink. Paul and Timothy, verses 22 through chapter 4, verse 1. One sentence to wives, one sentence to husbands, one sentence to children, slaves. You can see how someone would twist the scriptures to justify slavery in the South before the Civil War. But they've misinterpreted the scriptures. Why does Paul spend so much time talking to slaves in that church more than any other group? Here's why. When this letter was being read out loud, one of the people who was with the team that delivered it is a man named Onesimus, who is a former slave. And this letter is being written out loud. It's been read out loud to this church in Colossae, and they are seeing it. They're seeing it. And there's a former slave who's now on the leadership team of Paul, and he's no longer serving as a slave. And the slaves who are listening, they're going, what are we supposed to make of this? The masters who are there, and they're going, what are we supposed to make of this? And Paul's saying, this is how Jesus changes relationships. So he spends a lot of time. Look at verse 22. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eye is on you to curry their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart. And that's what I want you to focus on, all your heart. Verse 22 says, with sincerity of heart, as working for the Lord, not for human masters. Verse 24, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward, it is the Lord Christ you are serving. Would you write this down? This new financial power within the church is you serve others from your heart. You serve others from your heart. Jesus is your king, not the person in your church who earns the most money. Not the person in your church with the last name that's been there the longest. Jesus is your king. Serve him from your heart. Jesus is over any master you have. Look at verse 25. It says, anyone who does wrong will be repaid for their wrongs, and there's no favoritism. And then he says, masters, the word provide. Provide your slaves with what is right and fair, because you know that you have a master in heaven. In other words, Paul's saying there's going to be a payback. There's going to be justice. Injustice will be addressed. And your money can't buy you favor with God. And so you need to be right and fair, and you need to treat people equally. Look at Onesimus, who's standing there as a freed slave on Paul's leadership team. He's no longer called boy. You knew that back then, right? If you were a slave, a male slave, you were never allowed to be called a man in that day. And Paul says, Onesimus is a man, and he's my brother, and he's on my leadership team, and I trust him with my life. Would you write this down? Supply others. Provide your slaves. So write this down. Supply others from your plenty. Supply them out of your needs. Those of you who have money and power, use the influence God's given you to provide for those who don't have. Exalt those who feel oppressed and pushed down. Use your influence to lift them up. Treat them the way you want to treat yourself. So here it is. This is the new way we relate to each other in the church. I'd like you to spend a moment thinking about how you need to apply this truth in your household. I'd like you to think about how you want to apply this within your church family. Let's pray. Lord, we need a power that transforms our view of parenting and our marriages and our money and power. Jesus, we want to follow you, and we need your grace to do that. We need your grace, Lord. Give us the strength we need. Provide us, Jesus, all that we need to serve and love one another. Jesus, you are the cornerstone. It's your name that's written over the top of the church as the family of God gathers. And we're going to leave this place by your grace alone to love one another and to serve each other, to submit to one another out of reverence for you, Jesus. We pray this in your name. Amen.